Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Pro Mounting System for Unreal Engine 4. In this video, which is a continuation of part 1, we're going to be doing up the components to the interfaces that we added in part 1. In addition to that, towards the end of this, we're going to be setting up the seats for the mount within the actual mount itself. So once this is all done, this is officially the end of the major core things that you would need to do in order to get your mounting system set up. But after this, we're going to have a few more videos talking about how to set up an interaction system. If you already have your own interaction system, don't worry about it. I'm going to explain what function that you're going to need to call to just kick everything off. In this new version, if you've seen previous videos for this mounting system, I've done a lot of streamlining and making things a lot easier to understand and follow for this 1.3 version of the mounting system. And then 2.0 system of the mounting system is going to get rid of some of the older functions that I'm going to talk about that were in the previous videos. All right, so let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to start looking at is the character itself. So go to Blueprints, Mounting Character, and open it up. I already have the interfaces expanded, and we're going to start working with this, the Unified Controller Pawn. So the very first functions there are Prepare to Mount and Prepare to Dismount. These I call preparation functions. Every single, the mount and the player and the controller all have these prepare functions listed. The controller's prepare function is actually the major function that kicks everything off. But for the character, these functions can be where you set initial variables so that are things that need to change state within the pawn for mounting. Anything custom for your workflow for your character, this is where you would set them. Me, I don't have anything I need to change here. The only requirement is that in order for mounting to proceed without failing, these functions need to return true. So this is sort of a fail-safe area where if there's some condition that has to be met for your character to mount, maybe they need a license, maybe they need some achievement unlocked or some quest unlocked or something along those lines, this is where you can actually set up that logic to stop the mounting process. For us, for this demo, we don't have any such condition that we need to meet, so I'm going to make sure this returns true. Same for prepare to dismount. If for any reason your character can't dismount, maybe it's a special sequence within your game where your character's trapped inside a vehicle or it's on rails or something like that, then you can come here and put in logic so that this will fail, so the character will be unable to dismount. For demonstration purposes, we're going to make sure you can always dismount. The next real function that we're going to look at is mounted. Now, this is a pretty simple function to set up, so we're going to grab the mount writer component, and we're going to actually make this a validated get. The reason we're going to make this a validated get is because there may be instances, especially in the animation blueprint, which is constantly polling if there is a state change. So it's always calling this function on the mount. But what happens is towards the end of the game, when everything starts shutting down, the components are actually one of the first things that gets destroyed while the animation blueprint is still running. So this has a tendency to be called while it is already destroyed, and it can cause warning errors, but it won't actually crash your game. So with that in mind, that's why I always make this a validated get. So I'm going to pull this out. I'm going to say is mounted. And I'm just going to plug this right on in there. Oops. So I'm going to copy this and paste it, Control V. And then here for this not valid, we're just going to post that in there and return false. So now in any one of your characters, if it's not a mount rider, if it's just like some regular character, but it's trying to call these functions, it's just going to return false. So the next one is character mountable. This particular function is on the unified controller pawn. And for our character here, it is not mountable. Now, there's nothing stopping you from making a player character that can be mounted. But in this demonstration, we're just going to say the player character cannot be mounted. So, get character pawn. In this case, all this is going to be is our self. So we return a reference to our self for this function. Get mount. The next function. For this one, we're going to get the mount rider component, and we're going to say get current mount and plug that in. So what happens is whenever the player character is mounted, the mount rider component stores a reference to the mount within it. And then the last one, get character controller. What we're going to do is we're going to grab this mount rider component. I'm going to pull it out, and we're going to call a function called get rider controller. What this does is even when the mounting your character is mounted and no longer possessed by a player controller, what it's going to do is check for the mount and then get the player controller of the mount. So in this case, that will always be the proper player controller for the character. Okay, so the next interface we're going to hook up is the mount rider interface. And as you can see, it kicks off with start pawn mounting. So implementing this function is very straightforward, just like all the rest. You're going to grab the mount rider component, and then you're going to call a function called mount pawn. Move it up to where the strings align, and then just connect it in. And then we're going to take this, which this incoming parameter is going to be the actual mount that you're starting to mount. And then it's going to return true or false if that succeeded. And then start pawn dismounting. Going to be set up the same way. Grab the mount rider component and then dismount pawn. Going to feed the strings in just like this. And then this will be the mount that you are, or the pawn / mount that you are getting off of. Save that. So the next two functions are play mounting animation and play dismounting animation. We're going to get into how to set up these a little bit later. But for now, what we're going to do is going to keep them just as they are. So overall, if you have any animations that you want to set up, this is where you're going to be putting them. And there are plenty of ways to handle that. The main thing that you need to know is that this function passes in a position variable. And I explain everything about this in one of the later videos. It's an older video, but it's still completely relevant to the current version of the system. So that's why it's going to still be included in this overall set about animation, mounting and moving and all that. So we're going to cover that in another video. But until now, know that this position, you can use a switch, and you can see all the different positions that you could possibly mount from, which is sent here. This position is calculated, and we're going to go over how that calculation happens in a later video as well. And of course, that's going to be linked down at the bottom. But just know for now, because we are not going to set up any animations for this, but this is where you will set up animations if you need them. And there's plenty of ways that you could come up with getting those animations. You might have different animals or different vehicles or different ways of mounting and dismounting depending on those vehicles, depending on the height, depending on if you have dwarves versus humans or elves who are taller or smaller than each other. So they might have different ways of getting on. There's different ways of handling the types of animations that you need to play here. Right now, this is built for you to build that out and you to engineer that. Because frankly, the system is designed to accommodate any kind of game, not just specific games. So for now, we're going to leave this as it is. We're going to return false. And by returning false, we are telling the mounting system that we are not playing any animation. Therefore, skip to the next stage of mounting. And the same is going to be true for the dismounting. It behaves exactly like the mounting function. And we're going to basically tell it there is no mounting animation to play. So skip to the next part of the dismounting. So with that, we're going to go ahead and go to on move to mounting location complete. That's a mouthful. This function fires off if you have an instance where the character is moving into, like it interacts and then it needs to move into a position in order to start the mounting process, or you just want it to move into position before it teleports into the vehicle or on top of the mount, however you want to set this up. But this function is called at the end of that. And to implement it, you just mount rider component and do move to mounting location complete. So this fires off the next phase of the mounting process if you are using animations. And this is the function that you would call once you have finished moving your character into position, if you are going to move your character into position. So the next one is on mounting pawn finished. This function, you grab the mount rider component again and call pawn finished mounting. This interface function is called whenever the pawn completes the entire mounting process. I believe this is the function. Yeah, this is the interface function that the anim notifies need to call on the character in order to wrap up the actual animation system. So once your character starts getting on, climbs on top, sits down, this interface function is what the custom animations anim notifies that I've created call, or what you need to set up to call. Honestly, just use the custom anim notifies that I created. They do the job for you. But it does send in the pawn, the mount that you are currently mounted to, as just in case. But by this point, you can honestly just get the mount rider component and get the current mount. So the next function is on dismounting pawn finished. So this function might take a little bit of explaining, but the core easiest way to kind of handle it is get the mount rider component and do dismount finished. Okay. The next thing you might want to do is call stop anim montage if you're using anim montages. And I like to call specifically the dismount left on this. But basically what this will do is once the dismounting is finished, it then completes the whole dismounting procedure, detaches you from the mount, puts you where you need to be, and then it calls the stop animontage. Because the way the dismounting animations currently work is your character is offset from the capsule now. So if you need to stop that animontage immediately so that it doesn't look like your character teleported through the floor, then comes bouncing back, it just appears where it needs to be completely seamlessly. Okay, and then we set this up. And then we're going to return this value. Oops. From the dismount finished. Next function. We're going to skip this one and come back to it. The next one is seated on mount. This is a pretty simple little function that gets called to check if your character is completely finished mounting upon, and his bum should be completely seated on the mount, so he is assuming the I am mounted position. So we're going to grab this and then get is seated and just return that value. Oh, similar to the is mounted function here, we need to make this a validated get. Because if you're calling this from a animation blueprint, again, this component can be destroyed while the animation blueprint is still running. So it'll cause some minor irritating errors, but won't crash the system. It's just, you'll get a bunch of warnings at the end every time you shut down if your animation blueprint is polling this function in its event. So return false if this is not valid. Next one is driver. Is driver is fairly self-explanatory. It's simply a flag that indicates that yes, my character is driving this mount. And it has a direct component function called isDriver. Compile and save. Get rider mesh. This basically, this function at the moment does not need to be implemented, but will need to be implemented in the next version of this plugin. Effectively, all it does is allows the mounting system to get the character mesh without having to cast to a character object and get the mesh that way. This way, the mounting system, you can use whatever pawn type actor you want for your character to attach to things. The last one, well, one of the last ones is get rider component. This function is pretty simple. All it does is get the component. This is pretty useful if you are wanting to interact with the rider component in ways outside of, say, the actual interface that has been developed for it. That way you can just get the component and you have access to everything on that component. Pretty much all of the specialized interfaces have a similar function. Get rider component, get rider controller component, get rider mount component, or mountable pawn component, sorry. A similar function exists on all of these, and it's pretty darn useful for edge cases. This last function, get debug ID, you can ignore. This is mostly just for me, or if you need to debug the system or debug your own system. Basically what I do is I tend to assign like multiple players a different unique ID, an integer, and this allows me to see in logs or in other functions what the ID of this character is. For the most part, you can just leave it as 0 and it won't harm anything. If you have your own way of debugging these things, you can go ahead and use that. It's just a useful utility function. And that's it for setting up the character. Next, we're going to start looking at the mount itself.